Welcome to the Spiderforest Webcomic podcast. I'm Matthew Moyen. In this episode, Creature Comforts. Comics that call for fantastic creatures and alien races can be some of the most fascinating to read, and comics are among the best media for stories of this type. But sitting down and making these creatures believable is one of the most challenging parts of writing a comic. Where does an artist start with this task, and how do they make the impossible seem real? First up, our member Ewa of the comic Bits Fair brings us an interview with Zoe Maxine, creator of the comic The Queen Candidate. Then, our member Cat Feete of the comic Sunset Grill will be back for a discussion with more Spiderforest members, Alison Myers of the comics Out of My Element and My Hero, Sophie Pfrötzschner of the comic Soul's Journey, and Alyssa Steele of the comic The Ferrin. Aliens, monsters, demons, and beasts, we've got it all, so stay with us.
Hello, I'm Ewa and I draw a comic called Bits Fair. I really love reading stories that have settings that feel fresh and nothing like I've seen before, which is one of the reasons why I love The Queen Candidate, a comic drawn by Zoe Maxine. It's a story of how history repeats itself, war, politics, and coming of age. All the characters in The Queen Candidate are aliens, and when I sat down to interview Zoe, one of the things that I was very interested in was the way she designed the characters, and why did she decide to base her designs of the pen on bees?
Originally, when I was designing the aliens, they weren't really based on anything, and I was struggling to make them work. The first aliens I designed were actually one that you see the last, the enemy, the drone, that I designed the first, because I drew these raptor aliens. And I was like, oh, it's so much easier when you base them on an animal or something. And they weren't like full-on raptors, but they were kind of inspired by raptors. So when I went back to designing the other two races, I was like, okay, what kind of things that I could look for inspiration? So like the pen don't look like bees, but I did look at a lot of bugs. Visually, I took a lot from beetles and butterflies and dragonflies. But I went to bees and ants because they have really complex social structures. And I thought that would be really interesting to play with. So the pen are kind of take a lot of visual aesthetics from bees in terms of like having hexagons everywhere and a lot of their culture. And they're not bee specifically either, because they're aliens. There's a bunch of stuff about them that is just like inspired by human culture or inspired by other sci-fi. Because I didn't want them to be just straight up, this is a bee, but walking or whatever.
When it comes to designs, I remember you talking on Twitter some time ago about how you focused on designing your characters, making them visibly belong to the same race, but having them be visually distinct.
Yeah, I felt it was really important, partly because there's a bunch of sci-fi, and I'm going to be very nice and not name names and point fingers, where I would have difficulties picking out individual characters without very small characteristics. Like in one video game where all the aliens from Runways basically look the same, and you kind of have to just look for the tattoos or slight changes in colors, and they're all like slightly different shades of blue. So for Queen Candidate, I knew it's really important when designing characters that you have them be visually distinct, and I wanted it so that everybody could instantly know which character is which just from a glance, especially since it's an alien comic and alien names are hard to remember. So even if they can't remember These's name, they can be like the green and purple one. So when designing it, it made up basically rules. So like the pen, they all have antennae, but there's different ways that they can have antennae. They can have maybe only 2 antennae, or they can have like 4, or they can have like their antennae pointing downwards. Like Theseus has 2 that are kind of pointing downwards, whereas Yufei has 2 that are kind of pointing upwards, and they have like this weird like half-heart shaped attachment to them.
I also like how you use the antenna to express the emotions of the characters, with Yufei especially. I find it really cute.
Yeah, and that was something too, is that was one of the fun things about having them be aliens, is I could use stuff like that to help express themselves. All the pen have a second pair of eyes that are above their main pair of eyes that works sort of like eyebrows in terms of making expressions. But there's a few little things that I can do with them, like Yufei often, if she's talking to somebody, will be looking at that person, but her other pair of eyes will be looking at Thesa, because she's always a little bit concerned if she's doing a good job and if Thesa is like judging her or whatever. And it's something really subtle and not really something that you would notice. It's mostly just something fun that I put in while I'm drawing it. So I keep certain rules, like all pen have to have wings on their butts, but the shape of the wings and the color of the wings can change. They all have patterns, but the shape and the color of the patterns can change, and that kind of thing. So once you have a set of rules for the races, you kind of stick to it, and then you can basically design them to be very unique and distinct as long as they have certain features. It's kind of the same way of approaching, even drawing a human is. Every human has a nose and a mouth and ears. But you make sure, when you're not trying to same face, you try to make sure they all have different noses and different eyes and different ears. Humans all have the same sort of features, but they all look different on different humans. And I kind of approached aliens the same way. And I try to give them each their own unique color scheme so it can really pop. But I didn't want to rely on color scheme alone, partly because it's kind of lazy, and partly because, I also wanted it so that even if I drew it in black and white, or if somebody was colorblind, they'd still be able to tell who the characters are.
How much time did you spend designing before you started drawing the comic?
Oh, ages. A lot of it was a design experiment. I had the plot, and I was developing the plot at the same time, but some of my earliest designs were at least 3 or 4 years before I actually started the comic. It was more like the side hobby that I would do. A lot of the alien designs were on my notes in university that I would doodle in classes when there was a pause or a question that I wasn't interested in. So it wasn't like I took 3 or 4 years to design these aliens because I was super dedicated. It was more like I was designing these aliens in my spare time. And at some point, I was like, I should really actually draw this comic.
And when it comes to the comic, when it comes to the art of the comic, it has a lot of emphasis on shape and color. And when I look at your art, I sometimes think, do you think about these things when designing the page layouts? Or do you design the pages first and then think about things like shape and color?
Usually I draw a thumbnail, and when I design a page layout, I usually try to think of what kind of scene it is. For example, if it's a dialogue scene, I usually try to keep the page layout to boxes, even with slight variations in how the boxes are shaped. But if it's an action scene, the boxes get very angular, and a lot of directional lines, and establishing scenes. Or experimental scenes, like during a chase scene, I think. I had the page layout intertwined with what was going on. So I generally approach it that way. And then I think about what the movement is of the scene and what the characters are doing. And I try to make sure the page layout sort of is in sync with it. I like the page layout to actually add to the feeling of the scene.
When it comes to the art process itself, I think you were changing it to make the page production easier.
Yeah. Most of the comic so far has been done in Adobe Illustrator and using the pen tool. So basically what I would do is to get those big thick lines, I would basically draw them twice, point by point, going around. So, for people unfamiliar with vector graphics, a lot of digital art is done in pixels, which basically means you're just basically drawing on the screen. Vector art is mathematical and basically creates shapes by having points and curves and creating a shape out of those points. So, a triangle would be 3 points and no curves, whereas a circle might be 2 points and very wide curves, or 4 points and very wide curves. So when I was doing an Illustrator, I could be very, very precise with each and every line because I was basically plotting it out point by point. If that sounds very long and tedious, that is why I'm no longer doing it that way. It's very precise and perfectionist and extremely long.
Wouldn't it feel frustrating to abandon having that much control after having gotten used to it?
Oh yeah, it's difficult to let go of that perfectionism. I switched for a couple of pages to having it be essentially the pencil tool in Photoshop, and not the brush tool, the pencil tool, at 10,000 dpi or something ridiculous, so that you can still have that very smooth line. And it was still difficult because it's hard to get that exact curve because a lot of the shapes in the comics are very... I like big sweeping shapes, and it's very difficult to just draw that offhand. So for a couple of pages, I would try with pixels. And then I recently got a program called Clip Studio Paint, which is kind of Photoshop specifically for artists. There's a couple of tools in it I found that I really liked is that their lines were a lot smoother than Photoshop had them, so that I could mimic the big sweeping shapes a lot better. And then it just takes practice to try to get that visual look, and it also takes a lot of telling yourself that it's okay if it's not perfect. Like, try to get away from that, like, precision. Like, if the page gets done, it's a lot better than spending, like, 3 days doing line art when you don't really need to. And also try to adjust the style so it suits the new way of drawing. Because you can't do everything the same way that you did before, so you have to be like, okay, so what looks good while drawing it this way?
I thought I saw some change in style in the latest pages.
Yeah, it's gonna shift a bit, and especially since I'm still getting used to drawing the characters that way, because the previous way I had designed the characters specifically to be drawn in the previous way, so it's a lot easier to do other projects with just drawing with paper and as if it was like marker or whatever, because I hadn't designed those characters specifically to work in Illustrator. Which is, it's one of those drawbacks is that with a really highly stylized thing is if the style isn't working, you have to figure out your way around it. But so there will be slight differences in how it looks now, but hopefully the pages will get done a lot faster. So.
Well, that was a really interesting interview, and we're here now with a couple of members of Spiderforest Collective to talk further on this topic of creatures and designing creatures within your webcomic. With me here today, we have Alyssa Laraine Steele.
Yeah.
Sophie Pfrötzschner.
Yes.
Alison Myers.
Hi.
And I am Kat Feete. We're going to jump right in with some of these questions. When you're designing these creatures, these non-human characters, where do you start? For each of us, I think we're going to do this differently. Do you start with an idea of the type of alien or character that you want? Do you start with the design? Do you start with a personality? Alyssa, why don't you start us off?
Usually I start with what their speciality is, and then I go from there. But there's a couple of them that haven't been seen very often yet, where I went with more animal inspirations. Like there's a warrior species that's very much more like cuttlefish, and their expression is not in their face, it's in the skin color, and I'm excited to show them off when I eventually get to. But mostly I don't use an animal, I just try to use one sort of theme or a speciality versus an animal, because I don't want them to be recognizable as something based with humans. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So that's, the Ferrin is a science fiction comic, so let me get the other end of things in here. Alli, you're doing a fantasy comic. How did you start out?
The first comic we did, which was OME, I had to create these creatures that are alien but also fantasy-based. So what the direction that my husband gave me was that they had to be made of a goo. So I started with that base, and I pretty much made them have almost water-like appendages, but they were like slime. And the way they would move is they would just sort of splat their face into the ground because they didn't really have a face because their whole body was just this congealed massive blob, and they just keep moving that way. The current comic I'm working on now, the creatures I'm doing are based off of fantasy type characters and tropes, be it elves, dwarves, whatnot. We've added interesting little twists into them, and what I've done is I've taken inspiration from different cultures, different animals, and just different ideas, what the original fantasy base was based off of. Our elves are have golden skin, and their original, the goddess that they revere, they are trying to take after her. So her skin was golden, they've mimicked that, but she was plant-based in a lot of senses. So her hair is flower petals, and then she has dewdrops throughout the entirety of her hair, which sort of does a sparkle and a gem type thing to it. So the elves have been trying to base themselves off their goddess as best they can, which involves using a lot of magic to look pretty. The dwarves we've been doing, they are actually stone-based. So what I'm doing in some of the redesigns right now is I've done regular hairstyles. They look sort of like a base dwarf, but I've put stone overlays on them, and there's going to be aspects of them that's going to look sort of rocky in their hair and their beards.
Sophie, Soul's Journey, what are you doing in there with non-humans? Because that is, of course, a comic based pretty closely around wolves.
I started thinking with what kind of role do they have within the world and within the story too. So what are they representing compared to the human characters or the now wolf character? And from there, it was basically just getting their personalities right and having their beliefs kind of different but still relatable. That was important for me. I personally always think about what kind of role does a creature have in the world. Are they predators or anything? And how to incorporate that within a story. Does it make sense for them to actually appear there or doesn't it?
Okay, so that's three very different approaches. I'm coming from even a slightly different aspect. I also write a science fiction comic, but pretty much all of the aliens in that comic are off-screen. They never appear. I was pretty focused on the humans. I do have human sub-races, and so I was looking basically at designing people who are human but don't look like our basis for humanity. And so I have cyborgs, and I also have the Sunlanders, who were a genetically engineered slave race at one point in their past. And, just taking off that and looking at the designs, trying to make them different enough that they did not key into us, standard people, as human, but they were still humans. It was an interesting thing. I will just say that I pretty much just sort of made it up as I went along. I had very little artistic background, and I just kind of rolled with it. But it's been an interesting way. I think that, for me at least, almost always when I'm working with an alien species or even a human subspecies, it's asking myself, well, what is human and what isn't? And how are we defining that right now at this point in time and with this society? Is that sort of the way that you have tended to use aliens, or do you have a different reason for bringing creatures and non-humans into your world that you'd like to talk about a little bit?
I almost always want my aliens to simply be there as a purpose for saying, hey, you know what? We're probably not alone, not to mention we don't even know what's at the bottom of the deep ocean. So I try to at least be something that's not human. And not something that tries to relate to humans, just something else that exists. Like my favorite is the fish people right now. And I keep calling them the fish people. They're actually not fish. They're more like frogs or dolphins or something. I don't quite know how I've made them work in my head yet. But they're kind of like the closest to humans, emotionally speaking, out of the rest of the aliens that I have in some respects. Because they're like, the pursuit of knowledge, just like learn some stuff. But they don't behave as much as humans. They're not as emotionally flawed. They'll be like, hey, murder is just straight up wrong, guys. You're denying the potential of a future. That's wrong. You shouldn't do that. Potential is very important. That said, of course, they get a little weird about some other aspects on that one, but, Whereas I have another one that I like somewhat as much, but I'm trying to figure out how to make them work a little bit better still. They haven't been present too much, the new Vani, and they're the ones with the crazy horns in 3 years, and they're psychotically religious, so they're probably the second most human of the batch of aliens that I have, which probably sounds really bad, to be honest.
Well, I think that it is interesting as someone who's, writing and working with this stuff. You start to see really interesting things about what you think human is when you're designing these creatures. But yeah, let's hear from someone else. Alli, how about the aliens in Alm or in My Hero? Sorry.
Yeah.
Aliens, non-human races.
Well, actually, it's kind of funny because everybody but the humans in OME technically were aliens, because in the backlog that nobody had really seen at the time was that humanity had actually crash landed on Tesla. So the elementals are actually an alien race that are they're indigenous to Tesla itself. What ended up happening was when the elementals came in contact with the humans that crash landed from the first arcs, which are the cities in the comic, they ended up starting to take the form and shape of the humans so they could have a better rapport with them. And that's why when you hit the point in the story where you're at, where you're seeing the elementals in human form, they pretty much made themselves look that way so they could integrate with the human society.
Wow, that's really ambitious and really interesting, especially for a fantasy comic where you don't always see that kind of integration and talk about races. Sophie, you're coming from a slightly different direction because, of course, we already have wolves. Where were you working with that? When you decided to bring wolves into Soul's journey, was there a specific reason? I mean, you talked about this a little in the first question. I'd just like to hear more from you on that.
Well, the first thing I did for including wolves was actually, I thought wolves were easy to draw, but I had a lot of discussion with a friend to just see where this could go. And I thought, like, wolves are something relatively common, and they are often misunderstood, at least in terms of stories. For that, I just wanted to give them another venting point, so to speak. They're similar to human in terms of, they have a family and they care about one another, and yet they're slightly different because they have another lifestyle. There are cultures that are basically clashing there, but yet they're similar enough to just see we can get along. So it was for me this aspect to have a difference, big difference, which for wolves also is the appearance compared to humans. There are similarities and things can get along if one tries to understand one another.
Let's move on to some of the nuts and bolts here too, because we've all had to face this problem. You're introducing a race or a creature or an alien, often people either haven't seen before or have a very set, predisposed notion of, like something like what Sophie is talking about with what we think we know about wolves, and, certainly for fantasy races, what we think we already know about elves and dwarves. How do you introduce your creatures, your race? How do you say, okay, so this is what my race is like, and this is what you're going to be expecting from them, without at the same time overloading the readers and doing the horrible science fiction fantasy thing where you simply info dump everything in the first 2 pages and everyone's eyes glaze over.
When it comes to introductions, I had already sort of decided this at some point in my life, and I'm not actually sure because it was not specific to the Ferrin. Just so everybody knows, I am born and raised hardcore nerd. Like, every time I bring up the Ferrin to my parents, they would go, "Hey, you should go read this sci-fi, read this one, or read that one," and I've now read, like, piles more than I knew before. And I'd already decided that unless it was going to be a story specifically about one group or the other, which, to be totally honest, it is called the Ferrin, I would not necessarily say that it is 100% about the Ferrin as a species of their own. They will become more important, but when it comes to introducing other species that are not the Ferrin, I'm not as dedicated to making sure you know every single facet. Like, there will probably be Ferrin subspecies that I will never introduce. Some of the other complicated races that I made, because I've made at least 12 of them. There's at least 12. I know for a fact that I will probably not talk at all in depth about at least 4 of them. And I've just sort of accepted that, like, if I'm going to have them in the story, whatever character that is that race, that's going to be the introduction point, and it may even just stop there. Like, you only know this one, and you don't really know what their culture is, but you can kind of see, like, hints of it in the background, or in how it dresses, or in how it behaves. Like, oh, okay, this culture is, not what we thought it was, as it's been told through the eyes of other characters, but this character, clearly, like, has more depth to it, but you're not going to get to know that unless you, somehow come up to me and go, "Hey, I have money, tell me more." Like, I've just sort of accepted and intentionally will be not saying things about certain groups, so.
The commentary I've often seen for science fiction and fantasy is that your world building should be like an iceberg. 90% of it's underwater, and the audience never actually knows it's there, but it's still important for it to be there. I think that's what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I'm gonna be a really big dork lord and go, "Man, I love Yahtzee Kershaw, so much fun to listen to," but he literally at one point said everybody should have a headcanon about their own characters in the world. Like, have many headcanons, have tons of headcanons, but never intend to explain them.
Alli, with Out of My Element, your first comic, and also with My Hero, how are you working towards introducing these non-human characters and these different races and creatures?
Well, My Hero has a lot more Out of My Element did, because My Hero has 9 different planes, and on each plane there's a different race. Each of the races pretty much worships their own god or goddess, and every one of the races, except for the dragons, were actually based off the neutral, which is our humans. They're based off that template. They were just improved on by their own god. So a character like Lou, for instance, who is the first savage you meet, who's Hass's best friend, the savages are these big orc-like creatures, and they come from a plane where everything is just mass in size. And what they do is they go out on hunts and they get the biggest trophy. And those trophies tend to be sometimes giant animals that they carve out of and make it their homes. There's going to be an entire chapter later on where you're actually going to learn about their society and their rituals, and actually converting from one god's religion technically to another, which involves changing that person into a different species. The other race that you're going to see a lot more of are the Abyssals, because they're the main antagonists of the story, and you're going to learn about their society. They work off of a matriarchy. The queen is, you don't screw with the queen, she will end you. You see, with their case, their god his name is Jerzail, and he is based off of, each of the gods are based off of two sides of the same coin in a sense. So his base is strength and weakness. So the Abyssals are the strongest of all the races on the 9 planes. They have natural weapons in talons, claws, sharp tails with weapons on the end of them, horns. One thing I like to do with my creatures when I'm designing them is when I take a look at them, I want to see that when I put them in silhouette, you can still tell who they are, and they have a really neat figure to them. So you're like, that thing's all in black. I want to know what it is just because of the way it's shaped.
I noticed that with the introduction of the Abyssals within your comic, you didn't really get to see them for more than a very brief glimpse in the first chapter, I believe, but they were so very clearly different from anything else there that your eye was drawn to them. It was a really neat visual trick.
Yeah, and I've got a couple other races that are like that as well, except the savages, they're pretty much giant orcs. Lou is actually kind of small for a savage in all honesty, so when we get to that realm, you're going to see just like how big these things can get. The other race that is very interesting are the cursed, which are things like harpies, werewolves, fish people. They're just people that have made these deals, and now they're kind of like these mindless monsters in a sense in some cases, and the rest of the races view them as monsters because they are what we would see as an actual monster. Then you've got things like your seraphs, which are your generic angel type characters. Then there's the unclaimed, which are your vampires, your zombies, your ghosts. And they have a neat little thing in them where the way their goddess's realm is made is everything is eternal night, and it's an ongoing party. So when you see them in the darkness, they have these glowing tattoos and things all over them.
So it sounds like you really rely on the visuals to introduce these races, and then later on you just start to fill in the details about what they are and how they're different.
Yeah,
which is really neat.
Yeah, the way we do it, because Jim does the writing and I do the art, Jim has everything for the world building. It's like all in a document. We have all of it. So I take what he's written and I draw off that to do the designs for it. So we want the designs to really pop, so people are like, holy crap, that looks awesome. And then they start learning about it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is the way to try and do this, is to get people to ask the question first, and then you give them the answer, rather than give them the answers front-loaded.
Well, that's like one of the reasons, like, we decided, like, we're going to make the elves gold. Everyone's seen regular colored elves. They've seen dark elves. They've seen normal elves. Why are your elves bright yellow?
And so, Sophie, you're also dealing with, the wolves. And as you say, there's a lot of misinformation out there about wolves. How did you go about basically trying to say to people, in my comic, don't make assumptions. This is going to be a different take on wolf culture, on what they are and what they are in relation to us?
The comic itself started off with the wolves, so we had a short dream sequence and then we were with the pack. What I tried to do there was just bring across that the wolves are curious about this new person, but also afraid, since they don't really know what it is, or what he is, who he is. I wanted to bring across that in that case they are similar to humans. You don't really know what to do with the unknown in some cases. So in that aspect, I really want to go further with that to just show that people are the same, basically. And I didn't want to turn it into one of these Wolfaboo comics, where you just get these very colorful characters sometimes. And they are not some kind of supernatural wolves or anything. They are just normal wolves who got involved in this whole escapade.
And then, of course, your main character, for those who haven't read the comic, it's revealed fairly early on, so I don't think I'm spoiling this, that he has been turned from a human into a wolf and is trying to fit in with this wolf pack, or at least survive. So you've got that very interesting fish out of water character introduction, which is another great way of introducing something that people aren't familiar with, is to have someone there who's also unfamiliar. Was that a choice that you thought about?
Yes, I wanted to introduce the wolves from a perspective that isn't used to being around the wolves.
Yeah, it worked really well, by the way. I think that starting off with the wolves was a really interesting way to start that particular comic. I'm a very in media res person, so I pretty much just introduced the Sunlanders by having someone green on the screen talking. It is true, though, that one of the first things I introduced about the Sunlanders, and one of the first facts, was that they were under a curfew, that it was illegal for Sunlanders to be out in the city past 8 o'clock at night, because that was one of the first things I wanted to establish about them. They're a minority. They're in a very ugly situation. And, just sort of looking at what that does to you, that was one of the things that's basically when Sunlanders turn up. It is that question of, well, is this okay? Is this not okay? What is happening within this comic and stuff? I also wanted to talk a little bit, about once you have these non-human characters, the minute you have more than one of them, they're not human. Their features that they distinguish among each other are not necessarily that easy for people to pick up. How do you set up different non-human characters, or do you just try and stick pretty close to the archetype and say, well, all of this race are pretty close to the same, they act in the same way? How do you distinguish between these characters, visually or character-wise, or if you do at all?
In lieu of answering that, I feel like I need to at least add on to the first question's content a little bit.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And state that while I did actually did start off with a specific theme in mind, which I can't say what it is, when I made my first 3 aliens, and you will probably know more about the major 4 races than any other group section, I did end up drawing little sigils for all of them as my basis for what they looked like after that, or what kind of group they were. In terms of how they separate themselves and how they character-wise are different, at least with the fish people, it's really obvious right now that they very clearly have multiple colors going on. They're extremely colorful. But I kind of set out with the idea of I'm going to have some races that are very much like humans, very sexually dimorphic. They don't all look the same. Some of them look really different from each other. And then I have others. The Charian, I think we've only seen once, and he or she, I don't actually remember now. They didn't really say anything in the council chapter where I actually introduced at least the 3 major groups: the Ashitari, the Nuvani, and the Charian. The Nuvani being the crazy religious ones, the Ashitari being science nerds, and the Charian being, I will punch you in the face to solve most of my problems. The Charian don't have a physical difference beyond how they have an emotion, because all of their emotions are based in what pattern of color they have going on in their visible portions of their skin, to which they are actually the most naked of the species now, because they don't have to wear clothes, because they have to communicate with their skin, so no clothes for them. But I have intended that there will be characters that break the mold of each different group sort of setup, like the masked character in the Ferrin is the Nean. They're very much a species in which, kind of like some religions and social structures we have on Earth, you're not allowed to see their face unless they're like your child, your mother, or a lover. You don't see their face. Their entire social structure is built on the face that they wish others to see. And that Nean has been cast out, and that is not even the original mask that she made for herself. She was cast out because she messed up and showed her face in public. When that eventually gets fully revealed, because it is, I guess, somewhat of a spoiler in a way. For that character only, not really a plot spoiler, but that's basically what I've intended to do, is each character thus far that we've had, there will be at least one who breaks the mold of the stereotype for that species. There's at least one Charian who's like, yeah, I'm a scientist. And everyone's like, wait, y'all have scientists? And they're like, yeah, how the hell do you think we got to space? Of course we have scientists. Jeez. We didn't just, punch space and just keep punching until we got out there. That's not how that works. And the fish people can be very murderous. They, for the most part, are like, yeah, we value life. Life is good. But then they're also like, but if there's no other choice, we will kill you. We'll do it. It's bad. We'll do it, though. And the Nuvani are, like, super religious, but they have people in there who are like, I don't really believe it. I'm not going to say it out loud, but I don't really believe half this stuff that's being said, guys. I just wanted to go to space. And then there's a couple of others that are like that. Like, I've always, as a sci-fi nerd, I've enjoyed telepathic races and how they're often used. And they always seem to be in 2 categories. They're either completely disenfranchised, like the Ood and Doctor Who, or they're like mega powerful, like say the Protoss, who clearly speak telepathically. They have no mouth. They're like super powerful, but I wanted to have a species, and I'm still working on their name, so they don't have a name right now. They were clearly once a species that was very powerful, but they have not necessarily fallen into, like, slavery, but they clearly are just more of, like, your everyday Joe telepath. Like, yeah, that's just how we talk. There's nothing special about it. There's not this great hive mind. We're not magical. Because I want to kind of remove the illusion that a hive mind is highly superior to the individual mind, but at the same time, like with humans, sort of, we tend to think, oh, the individuality is the greatest thing in the universe. But without revealing anything vitally important, at some point that too will be called into question, like, how important is it to be a hardcore individual and have no connection to your planet, community, social, whatever?
Well, is that even true? Are we really just islands or not?
Yeah, so
okay.
That'll be fun.
That will be fun. All right, Alli, can you weigh in on this? How important is it for you to have people see you, the members of your race, as individuals, and how are you accomplishing that?
Most of the characters in my hero are originally based off a human template, so they're not really getting away from that side of it. They just have different aspects, like I said, that they gain from their god that make them look different. And one thing I like to do with the characters is each specific character, depending on where they're coming from, be it a side character or one of the main characters, they have their own unique personality, and that's sort of seen in the way they're designed, the way they move, the way they talk, things like that.
Yeah, and you've definitely got a lot of size differences as well in characters that, you're making them very easy to distinguish from each other. I've noticed that with my hero.
Yeah, definitely. Just because it makes it, I find it's more visually appealing.
So, Sophie, you're working with wolves, and that has to be a little bit challenging. It's all wolf.
Well, all of these characters have a different personality, so yeah, they are different from one another, and they are individuals, but they still act as a pack, at least when they have a pack. They value family and all, but it's not like one is oppressed by the group. So if somebody has an idea, things are being listened to, but it doesn't necessarily get implemented in that point.
Your main character, who is the human wolf, does have a specific marking that makes it easy to tell which one he is. And I thought that was a very good design choice on your part.
Yeah, for the wolves especially, I thought different fur colors are definitely an advantage. And then my main character, now turned wolf, also has this necklace. So he is definitely easy to distinguish, even if we just go by shape. And I try to also do that with the other wolves, to have the fur act in different ways. Namide, for example, has this really high-strung cheek fur, and the others have more like something that hangs down, which I also thought should represent the personality a little, since Namide is more like a happy-go-lucky character, while Anurag is, of course, now that he's turned wolf, not quite comfortable with his situation.
Yeah, I actually had this situation happen in my own comics, some of which is simply because, as I said, I'm not a very good visual person. I have two main Sunlander characters, and they are very different. But I didn't realize at one point that I had been showing them one character was always indoors, and the other one was always either outdoors or coming in from the outdoors. And so one of them was always basically wearing a tank top, and the other one was always wearing a jacket. I switched that up at one point. The outdoor character was indoors and wearing a tank top, and people became confused. And I thought, well, there's a sign that I'm messed up. Because I was hoping that these two characters, I went personality-wise and made them very different because I didn't want to fall into the stereotype of all Sunlanders are like this, and they're very different people. But I did not focus nearly enough on the visual aspect of letting people see that they're different. And of course, they're humans. We shouldn't have been missing those cues simply because they're always tall, always green, and tend not to be as sexually dimorphic as standard humans. Sexually dimorphic meaning that there's a lot of difference between females and males, in other words, so our heights, strengths, etc. That's sexual dimorphism. So that was an interesting experience for me in realizing that you got to hit both ends. You're going to need to have different personalities and different character and different visual profiles. Something I'd like to really work on a lot more. All right, well, we are heading towards the end of our time, so I kind of want to do a summary question here and talk to you guys about how it's affected your comic, having different creatures, having, different races in the comic. How do you feel that adds to comics?
Personally, it gives me some comfort in a weird way. As I said, I'm born and raised nerd. I detest the idea that we would be truly alone in the universe, so I tried to make a lot of species, and it's comforting to me to have a universe that's very full of different kinds of life. There'd be nothing worse than to go out into space or into the universe and find that we were a fluke. We were the only ones. We're the only existing intelligent species, and nothing else has ever happened. Like, that would be so depressing.
I just like the idea of having a full, colorful cast. Humans are great and all. They're fun to draw to an extent, but being able to draw fantastical creatures that have different aspects to them, but you still can identify aspects of them that are human so that the reader's like, oh, I can totally understand this, or it's something that's based off of what I already know of this specific species. that they can recall and actually have a familiarity with. I find that is always fun. Then also on the flip side, being able to design something that just sort of comes out of nowhere and people are like, what the hell is that? And that was sort of like our primals that we did back in OOME. When they came out at the end of the comic there, people were just like, holy crap, what are these things? And then when they realized how terrified the actual characters were, they're like, oh, these things mean business.
Okay. And Sophie?
The wolves are an integral part of the story, so they are really, really important there. And they are also moving the story along. So they are basically characters that just belong there. And of course, I also come from an animal drawing background, mostly. I got into humans a lot later than I got into drawing animals, mostly because I basically thought animals were a lot easier to draw. So I'm always looking forward to the wolf parts of the comic, since they are going a lot faster.
And I think it's important, it's somewhat what I'm hearing from all of you, is that it's important to remember that, whether there are aliens out there or not, we do share the world. And it's great to be able to acknowledge that in comics sometimes.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like we've run out of time once again. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support, and don't forget that you can go to spiderforest.com and read all of our comics for free. We create comics of all genres, over 70 of them, and at spiderforest.com you can also join the discussion on our forums, interact with our creators, and much more. That's all at spiderforest.com. And of course, if you'd like to help us make more comics and podcasts, please consider clicking on support to make a donation. Any amount you donate goes directly to fund our work, and we are grateful to you for helping us out. I'd like to thank our special guest for this episode, Zoe Maxine. You can read her comic, The Queen Candidate, at queencandidate.zoemaxine.com. Our thanks also to Eva for bringing us that interview. I'd also like to thank Kat Feete for bringing us this episode's discussion, as well as our members who participated, Alison Myers, Sophie Pfrötzschner, and Alyssa Steele. Kat Feete produces the comic Sunset Grill. You can read it at sunsetgrillcomic.com. Alison Myers co-produces the comic My Hero with Jim Perry. You can read it at myherocomic.com. Sophie Pfrötzschner produces the comic Soul's Journey. You can read it at soulsjourney.garetianchronicles.com. And Alyssa Steele produces the comic The Ferrin. You can read it at comic-san-seraph.com. That's Seraph with a PH. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. And I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Matthew Moyen. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
How do I say anything about my Ferrin without reviewing anything? Because my aliens are so... Everything in race-wise in my comic is so... Yeah, there's reasons for all of it, but I can't literally say what those reasons are yet, because it's fairly major.